I'm about to share something that might surprise you, especially if you've been managing high blood pressure for years. Not because the science is new. In fact, most of the research behind what I'm about to explain has existed in medical journals for quite a long time. The surprising part is that many patients never hear about it. Over the years, I've watched many responsible health-conscious seniors do everything their doctors recommend. They take their medication exactly on schedule. They avoid salty foods, they attend every checkup without fail. And yet, their blood pressure numbers barely move. If that sounds familiar, I want you to understand something important. Often, the problem isn't that you're doing something wrong. The real issue is that blood pressure is influenced by several biological systems at once, but most treatments focus on only one of them. Today, I want to walk you through 7 key mechanisms inside the body that affect blood pressure, especially as we age. When you understand these mechanisms, the whole picture starts to make sense. But first, let me tell you about someone I'll call Raymond. Raymond was 74 when he came to see me. He had been on blood pressure medication for more than a decade. He was one of the most disciplined patients I'd ever met. Every morning he took his pills at exactly the same time. He followed dietary advice carefully and had practically eliminated added salt from his meals. In fact, his wife joked that their salt shaker had been sitting untouched for years. Yet Raymond's blood pressure remained stubbornly high. His readings at home typically stayed between the mid-150s and mid-160s systolic, despite 2 medications and excellent lifestyle habits. When Raymond sat down in my office, he placed a neatly organized folder on the desk. Inside were printed blood pressure readings from his home monitor, medication lists, and several recent lab reports. He had clearly put time and thought into understanding his health. Then he asked me a question I've heard countless times. He said, "Dr. Serrati, I'm doing everything they told me to do, so why isn't it working?" The honest answer surprised him. I told Raymond that the approach he had been given wasn't necessarily wrong. It was simply incomplete. You see, blood pressure isn't just a number that randomly rises or falls. It's the result of a constant biological negotiation happening inside your arteries every second of the day. Some forces inside the body push blood pressure upward. Others work to relax the arteries and bring it down. Medication usually targets one of these forces. But when several other drivers are still active at the same time, the body keeps pulling that number right back up again. That's exactly what was happening to Raymond. When we looked deeper, we found that multiple hidden mechanisms were influencing his blood pressure, and his treatment had only been addressing one of them. Once we began correcting the others, something remarkable started to happen. But before I explained the first change, Raymond made the one that surprised him the most. You need to understand a simple concept about how blood vessels actually respond to physical signals inside the body, because this first mechanism involves something incredibly simple, and it takes less than 15 minutes. Before I explain the first change Raymond made, you need to understand something about how your blood vessels behave. Your arteries are not rigid pipes. They are living tissue. Each artery wall is lined with millions of endothelial cells that constantly sense changes in blood flow, pressure, and movement. When these cells detect certain signals, they release a molecule that acts like a natural relaxant for the blood vessels. That molecule is called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide tells the smooth muscle wrapped around your arteries to loosen. When the arteries relax, they widen. And when they widen, blood pressure naturally drops. In younger bodies, this system works beautifully. But with aging, inflammation, and years of stress on the cardiovascular system, nitric oxide production becomes weaker. The arteries lose some of their flexibility and the balance begins to shift toward higher pressure. Most blood pressure medications try to correct this chemically. But there's another way to stimulate nitric oxide that doesn't involve a prescription at all. It involves a very specific type of muscle contraction. When Raymond first heard this, he looked at me with obvious skepticism. After all, he had already been exercising regularly. Every morning he walked around his neighborhood for about 30 minutes. But despite his consistency, his blood pressure hadn't improved. The reason is that not all exercise sends the same signal to the blood vessels. Aerobic activity like walking certainly has many benefits. It improves circulation, strengthens the heart, and supports overall health. However, the nitric oxide response it creates is spread out over time and often relatively mild. There is another form of exercise that creates a much stronger signal inside the artery wall. It's called isometric hand grip training. This technique works because of something called shear stress. When you squeeze an object and hold the contraction steadily, blood flow in that area briefly becomes restricted. Then, when you release the squeeze, blood rushes back through the vessels. That sudden surge creates friction against the endothelial lining of the arteries. The cells interpret that friction as a signal and respond by releasing nitric oxide into the bloodstream. And the fascinating part is this: the effect doesn't stay in your arm. Nitric oxide circulates through the entire vascular system. relaxing arteries throughout the body. That means a short activity in the hand can influence blood pressure everywhere. When I explained the process to Raymond, he laughed and said it sounded almost too simple, but he agreed to try it. The protocol is surprisingly straightforward. You squeeze a hand grip device or even a rolled towel at about 30% of your maximum strength. Not as hard as you can, just a firm, steady hold. You maintain that squeeze for 2 minutes, then rest for about a minute. This cycle is repeated 4 times. The entire session takes roughly 12 minutes. Raymond began doing it in the evenings while sitting in his favorite chair watching the news. No gym equipment, no complicated routine, just a rolled towel in his hand. 4 weeks later, he came back with a new set of readings from his home monitor. His systolic blood pressure had dropped 11 points. He told me the whole thing felt almost ridiculous. For years, he had been adjusting medications, avoiding salt, and following strict routines. And now he was seeing measurable improvement from something that took less time than brewing a pot of coffee. But this first step revealed something important. Stimulating nitric oxide works, but only if the body is able to protect that molecule once it's produced. And in many seniors, something inside the bloodstream is quietly destroying nitric oxide before it has a chance to help. Raymond was one of them. The reason turned out to involve a compound that many people pass in the grocery store every week, without realizing its powerful effect on blood pressure, and it comes from a bright red flower. After Raymond began the hand grip routine, we saw his numbers start to shift. An 11-point drop in systolic pressure in just a few weeks is meaningful. But something else quickly became clear. That improvement could have been even greater. The reason is that nitric oxide, the molecule we stimulated with the exercise, is extremely fragile inside the bloodstream. Certain chemical processes can destroy it before it ever has a chance to relax the arteries. When that happens, the body works harder and harder to maintain balance, and blood pressure creeps upward again. This led us to the second mechanism affecting Raymond's blood pressure. To understand it, we need to talk about an enzyme in the body called ACE, which stands for angiotensin-converting enzyme. ACE plays a powerful role in controlling the tone of blood vessels. Here's what it does. Inside the bloodstream, ACE converts a relatively mild compound called angiotensin I into a much stronger molecule known as angiotensin II. This second molecule acts like a signal telling the smooth muscles surrounding arteries to tighten. When arteries tighten throughout the body, blood pressure rises. Many prescription medications for hypertension are called ACE inhibitors. Their job is exactly what the name suggests. They block that enzyme so the tightening signal is reduced. When ACE is suppressed, arteries stay more relaxed and blood pressure often falls. Raymond was familiar with the concept because one of his medications worked through this pathway. But during our conversation, I asked him something that caught him off guard. I asked if anyone had ever mentioned that certain plant compounds can influence the same enzyme. He shook his head. One plant in particular has drawn attention in clinical research for this effect: hibiscus. Hibiscus sabdariffa, the flowering plant used to make hibiscus tea, contains natural pigments called anthocyanins. These compounds are responsible for the deep red color of the flowers, but they do much more than create color. Anthocyanins interact with the ACE enzyme in a way that can reduce its activity. By slowing that conversion process, they help prevent the surge of angiotensin to that tightens arteries. Several clinical studies have examined this effect. In some controlled trials, participants who consumed a strong daily hibiscus infusion experienced meaningful reductions in blood pressure over several weeks. The improvement wasn't instantaneous, but the trend was consistent. When I described this research to Raymond, his reaction was cautious curiosity. He had been a coffee drinker for decades and wasn't particularly enthusiastic about herbal teas. But he agreed that if the science supported it, it was worth trying. The preparation matters. What's needed is a strong infusion made from dried hibiscus flowers, steeped in hot water long enough to extract the anthocyanins properly. Lightly flavored commercial drinks often contain only trace amounts of the active compounds. Raymond began drinking 1 cup each morning. At first he told me the flavor was extremely tart, almost like cranberry without the sweetness. But after a week or two, he stopped noticing it. His wife actually began enjoying the tea and started making it for both of them each morning. At this point, Raymond had addressed 2 mechanisms influencing his blood pressure: stimulating nitric oxide through vascular shear stress, and reducing excessive vessel tightening through ACE modulation. But something interesting began happening when we reviewed his progress. Even though his numbers were improving, they still fluctuated more than I expected. That's when I asked him a question that many patients find surprising. How much time do you spend in the sun each day? His answer revealed the third hidden mechanism affecting his blood pressure, one that has nothing to do with vitamin D and everything to do with how sunlight interacts with the skin. When I asked Raymond how much time he spent in the sun, he paused for a moment. Then he said something I hear from many seniors. Not much. My doctor told me years ago to stay out of the sun. About a decade earlier, Raymond had a small precancerous spot removed from his shoulder. His dermatologist advised him to be cautious about sun exposure, and Raymond took that advice very seriously. Since then, he had made a habit of avoiding the sun almost entirely. Morning errands were fine, evening walks were fine, but the middle of the day, when sunlight was strongest, he stayed indoors. At first glance, that sounds like responsible behavior, but the body contains a biological mechanism most people have never been told about, a mechanism that depends specifically on sunlight. And it has nothing to do with vitamin D inside the skin. There exists a large storage reserve of a compound called nitrite. This nitrite sits quietly in the skin until it receives a very particular signal. That signal is UVA light. When UVA rays reach the skin, they trigger a chemical reaction that converts stored nitrite into nitric oxide, the same molecule we discussed earlier that relaxes blood vessels. Once released, this nitric oxide moves into the bloodstream and begins dilating arteries throughout the body. The effect is surprisingly fast. Researchers studying this pathway found that after moderate sun exposure, nitric oxide levels in circulation can increase within minutes. As the vessels relax, blood pressure begins to fall and often stays lower for several hours afterward. What makes this discovery particularly interesting is that it operates independently of vitamin D. Most people associate sunlight only with vitamin D production. That process actually depends on UVB light, which behaves differently from UVA. UVB varies with seasons and can be blocked by clouds or certain geographic conditions. UVA, however, penetrates clouds much more easily and remains present throughout most daylight hours. This means the nitric oxide pathway in the skin can still function even when vitamin D production is limited. When I explained this to Raymond, he listened carefully. He had spent years thinking that avoiding sunlight was the safest possible decision for his health. Learning that sunlight also plays a role in blood vessel relaxation required him to reconsider that assumption. But balance is the key here. This mechanism does not require long periods of sun exposure. In fact, extended exposure would carry its own risks. Research suggests that about 20 minutes of midday sunlight on the arms and legs can activate this nitric oxide pathway effectively. After that short window, protective measures like sunscreen become important again. Raymond decided to experiment cautiously. Instead of staying inside during the middle of the day, he began taking a short walk around noon. He left his arms uncovered during that walk and applied sunscreen afterward if he remained outside longer. Within a few weeks, he told me something interesting. The midday walks didn't feel like exercise to him. They felt more like a reset. He described a noticeable sense of calm afterward, as if the tension he carried during the morning had softened. At that point, we had addressed 3 mechanisms influencing his blood pressure: stimulating nitric oxide through hand grip training, reducing arterial tightening through hibiscus compounds, releasing nitric oxide from the skin through sunlight. But Raymond's story was about to relook entirely. He had spent 4 years eliminating salt from his diet, and yet his blood pressure still refused to normalize. What we discovered next explained why reducing sodium alone sometimes fails. Because the real issue inside many artery walls isn't too much sodium. It's not enough potassium. For years, Raymond believed the key to controlling his blood pressure was simple: reduce salt as much as possible. He had followed that advice carefully. Restaurant meals were rare because he couldn't control how much sodium was used. At home, his wife cooked without adding salt, and the salt shaker on their table had gathered dust for years. From a medical perspective, Raymond looked like the ideal patient, but his blood pressure readings told a different story. Despite all the effort, his systolic numbers remained stubbornly high. When we reviewed his history together, it became clear that something important had been missing from the conversation he'd been having with his doctors. The truth is that sodium is only half of the equation when it comes to blood pressure regulation. Inside the smooth muscle cells that form the walls of your arteries, there are tiny molecular machines called sodium-potassium pumps. These pumps play a crucial role in keeping the cells balanced. Their job is simple but essential. They push sodium out of the cell while pulling potassium into the cell. When this system works properly, the cells inside the artery wall stay stable and flexible. But when potassium levels are too low, the pumps cannot function efficiently. And that's where problems begin. When sodium isn't pushed out effectively, it starts accumulating inside the cells of the artery wall. Water follows sodium naturally through a process called osmosis. As a result, the cells begin to swell. This swelling thickens the arterial wall from the inside. And when arteries become thicker and less flexible, the space for blood to flow narrows. The heart must push harder to move blood through those vessels, which causes blood pressure to rise. So even if someone reduces sodium intake, the underlying issue can persist if potassium remains too low. In other words, removing salt from the diet does not automatically restore the cellular balance inside the artery wall. Without enough potassium, the pumps simply cannot do their job. When I explained this to Raymond, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. In more than a decade of appointments focused on blood pressure, no one had ever discussed potassium with him in detail. No one had asked about the foods he ate that might supply it. That's when we began looking at ways to increase potassium naturally through diet. Many people immediately think of bananas when potassium is mentioned. While bananas do contain potassium, they are far from the most concentrated source. Some foods provide far greater amounts. Avocados, for example, contain significantly more potassium per serving than bananas. Leafy greens, especially the tops of beet plants known as beet greens, are among the most potassium-rich vegetables available. Even plain coconut water can supply a meaningful amount of potassium in an easily absorbed form. Raymond decided to experiment with simple additions. He began adding half an avocado to his breakfast most mornings. His wife started using beet greens in salads instead of discarding them when she bought fresh beets. In the afternoon, he drank a small glass of unsweetened coconut water. Within a couple of weeks, he noticed something unexpected. After years of strict restriction, he suddenly felt as if his diet had become easier rather than harder. Instead of focusing only on what he had to remove, he was now adding foods that supported his body's natural balance. But just as his blood pressure readings began to stabilize further, another hidden factor emerged. There was a substance circulating in Raymond's bloodstream that had never been measured during his routine blood pressure checkups, a substance capable of blocking the body's nitric oxide system entirely. And until it was addressed, every improvement we had made would only go so far. By the time Raymond had implemented the first 4 changes, something interesting had started happening. His blood pressure readings were improving, but they were inconsistent. Some days his numbers looked promising. Other days they seemed to drift upward again without an obvious reason. That pattern suggested that something deeper was still interfering with the body's ability to regulate pressure properly. This is when we looked at a marker that almost never appears on a routine blood pressure panel. That marker is uric acid. Most people associate uric acid with gout, a painful condition that often affects the big toe. Because of that association, many assume uric acid is only relevant if joint pain appears. But the story is much broader. Uric acid can also influence how the inner lining of the arteries behaves, specifically the endothelial cells, responsible for producing nitric oxide. As we discussed earlier, nitric oxide is one of the body's most powerful natural tools for relaxing blood vessels. It allows arteries to widen and helps maintain healthy circulation. To produce nitric oxide, endothelial cells rely on an enzyme known as ENOS, endothelial nitric oxide synthase. Think of ENOS as the factory that manufactures nitric oxide. When uric acid levels rise too high in the bloodstream, this factory can begin malfunctioning. Instead of producing nitric oxide efficiently, the enzyme may generate unstable oxygen molecules that actually destroy nitric oxide. This process creates oxidative stress inside the artery wall. So rather than helping vessels relax, the chemistry inside the arteries begins doing the opposite. The nitric oxide that should be protecting circulation is reduced and inflammation increases. The result is a vascular environment that encourages higher blood pressure. When I suggested testing Raymond's uric acid level, he looked surprised. In 11 years of managing hypertension, no one had ever ordered that test. It simply wasn't part of the routine panel used during his quarterly checkups. When we finally measured it, the result was revealing. Raymond's uric acid level was 7.8 milligrams per deciliter, well above the range where nitric oxide production tends to function smoothly. In practical terms, that meant many of the strategies we had already implemented were working against an invisible obstacle. His body was producing nitric oxide, but the chemical environment in his bloodstream was partially destroying it. Reducing uric acid became the next priority. There are several ways to approach this, including dietary changes and certain plant compounds that support the body's ability to clear uric acid through the kidneys. One natural compound that has received attention in clinical research comes from tart cherries. Tart cherries contain anthocyanins, the same family of pigments that appear in hibiscus, which have been shown to support healthy uric acid metabolism. Extracts derived from these cherries are commonly used to help lower uric acid levels gradually over time. Raymond began taking a moderate daily dose. Over the following weeks, his uric acid level began to fall. As that number decreased, the nitric oxide system inside his arteries started functioning more efficiently. He described the change in a way that many patients do. It wasn't a dramatic overnight transformation. Instead, he felt a slow return of ease, as if something inside his chest had quietly relaxed. By this point, we had addressed 6 of the mechanisms influencing his blood pressure. But there was still one remaining factor that most people would never suspect. It involves a food you can buy in almost any grocery store. A leafy green vegetable that contains one of the highest concentrations of natural nitrates found in plants. Yet most people never receive the blood pressure benefit from it. Not because the biology doesn't work, but because of one simple mistake they make every time they eat it. By the time Raymond had addressed 6 different mechanisms influencing his blood pressure, his readings had already improved significantly. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle, and, surprisingly, it involved something most people do every single day without thinking: eating. More specifically, how certain foods interact with bacteria in the mouth. Many people don't realize that the mouth plays an active role in regulating blood pressure. The surface of the tongue hosts communities of beneficial bacteria that participate in an important chemical process. When we eat foods rich in dietary nitrates, these bacteria convert those nitrates into nitrates. After swallowing, those nitrates travel into the stomach where they are converted into nitric oxide, the same molecule that relaxes blood vessels and improves circulation. This process is known as the arteries salivary nitrate pathway, and it serves as a backup system for nitric oxide production in the body. In other words, even if the main nitric oxide pathway inside the artery walls becomes less efficient with age, the body has another method available, but it only works when 2 conditions are met. First, the food must contain enough nitrates to supply the pathway. Second, the nitrates must spend time in the mouth, so the bacteria on the tongue can convert them. And that's where one particular vegetable becomes very interesting. Among all commonly available plant foods, arugula contains one of the highest concentrations of natural nitrates, gram for gram. It often surpasses many other leafy greens that are commonly associated with heart health. When eaten regularly, arugula provides abundant raw material for nitric oxide production through the arteries salivary pathway. However, most people accidentally bypass the mechanism. They blend greens into smoothies or swallow them quickly without chewing thoroughly. When that happens, the nitrates move past the tongue bacteria too quickly and the conversion process never fully occurs. The key step is slow, deliberate chewing. When arugula is chewed well, the leaf matter mixes with saliva and remains in contact with the bacteria on the tongue long enough for nitrate conversion to begin. Only then does the chain reaction leading to nitric oxide production take place. Raymond added a simple arugula salad to his daily routine. At first, he noticed the peppery flavor immediately. It was stronger than the lettuce he was used to, but after a couple of weeks he began to enjoy it, especially when paired with olive oil and lemon. He also made another small change that turned out to be important. For years he had used a strong antibacterial mouthwash every morning and evening. While mouthwash can support oral hygiene, certain antibacterial formulas eliminate the same bacteria responsible for nitrate conversion. Once those bacteria disappear, the nitric oxide pathway cannot function properly. Raymond switched to a gentler oral rinse that did not disrupt those bacterial communities. Within a few months of implementing all 7 strategies, his blood pressure numbers stabilized in a range he hadn't seen in years. At his next cardiology appointment, his systolic reading was 138. For a man who had spent years between the mid-150s and mid-160s, despite medication and careful lifestyle habits, the difference was remarkable. His cardiologist reviewed the numbers and asked what had changed. Raymond handed him a page where he had written down each of the 7 mechanisms we discussed, not as instructions but as an explanation of the biology behind them. After reading the list, the cardiologist paused and said something that stayed with Raymond. "I recognize every one of these mechanisms. I've just never explained them together in a single appointment, and that is often the real issue. Most medical visits focus on adjusting the number that appears on the blood pressure monitor, but the number itself is simply the final result of many biological forces working together inside the body. When more of those forces are understood and addressed, the picture can begin to change." And that is exactly what happened for Raymond.